All right, thanks. Good evening, folks. This is Bart Lombardo, and I'm going to be the featured tire on tonight's Norvise live event. Good evening, folks. This is Bart Lombardo, and I'm going to be the featured tire on tonight's Norvise live event. And just give me a few seconds to set up the comments here, so I can see what's going on. That's the only thing that I'm having an issue with. I think everybody should have a pretty clear view of the vise, and hopefully you can hear my voice. The only thing I have to do is be able to access comments here, which I'm having a little difficulty with. So just bear with me for a few minutes while I try and work that out. Just if you can, if you're hearing and seeing this, just leave a comment below so I can see that. I believe I have it now, but now I've got a delay. Hold on, folks. Sorry. Got to shut off the sound on this. Now I've got a delay. Got to shut off the sound. All right, that should be working now. Again, if you're able to see this video, hear my voice, just if you would, just drop a comment. I see a couple people signing on, but I still don't have any indication that anybody can actually hear my voice. For some of the folks that are signing on, if you can hear my voice, just leave me a comment so I know that this is working. You should see it fly in the vise and hear my voice. I got a feeling folks may not be able to hear me. Just bear with me for a few minutes. All right, I think we're good to go. I think folks can hear me. I did see one comment there that somebody could hear. Very good. All right, let's get going. Again, my name is Bart Lombardo from Panfish on the Fly, and today I'm going to tie one of my popular frog patterns called the Melon head frog. That's what's in the vise right now. And but before we get started, I wanted to thank the fine folks over at Norvise for giving me the opportunity to come out and tie for them this evening. And before we get started, I just want to make an announcement for those of you that are fans of Norvise. You may have saw this evening that they made an announcement in regards to a limited edition vise that came out. They announced it yesterday, Saturday morning, and it is the Stormtrooper version of the vise that I am tying on right now, and it is an all white Creocoat coated Norvise with black hardware. Absolutely awesome looking, and it's a limited edition. It is there were 10 of them made for 2022, and it's my understanding that there will be additional limited editions each year. There were only 10 made of this particular vise, and I believe at the time that this recording started that there were only 4 left. So if you are interested in picking up one of those limited edition white and black Norvise vices, get a hold of them as quick as you can because they are not expected to last. All right, let's get started. Again, my name for those that are just joining is Bart Lombardo, and I am from Panfish on the Fly. And this evening I am tying my melon head frog, and if we have time, maybe a few other frog patterns on a Norvise. So let's get started. Just go over the materials that I use to tie this pattern. This pattern is a version of an old-time panfish and bass pattern called a round dinny. Now, the round dinny was made by the Ricardo Tackle Company, and it was basically a round popper for panfish and bass. And I tie a number of different versions of this fly. This one happens to be a frog version. And the main material for the body is basically a cork ball. It's a half-inch cork ball. They're not too hard to find. If you do a little searching, you can probably source them on your own. I actually, on the Panfish on the Fly website, we offer a round dinny kit that actually has 8 corks and 8 balls for you to tie your own round dinny style poppers. So the main body is the half-inch cork ball. For the legs, I'm using Cohen's Creatures frog legs, and these legs were tinted up with a permanent marker, actually a fabric marker. You could use Copic markers and other alcohol-based permanent markers, but they will bleed a little bit. Once the fly has repeated dunkings, the colors kind of fade. I don't think it makes any difference at all to the fish, and I go back and forth between using fabric markers and Copic markers. Other materials, we got some silicone legs. There is some Semperfli ice Straggle Chenille in for the body, and just some Chartreuse and black dyed Grizzly Hackle for the collar. The head is, again, it is colored with permanent markers, and I do use the alcohol-based permanent markers for coloring the head or tinting the head, and that is coated with UV resin. I use a Solares medium UV resin for the finish coat on the fly itself. And for the eyes, I'm using 4mm dragon eyes. Obviously, you can use any eyes you want or eliminate them altogether. So let's get started. For a hook, I'm using a size 6 Kinked shank popper hook. I believe the hooks that I'm using right now, these are Mustad hooks, but any size 6 hook will work. I like a size 6 because, number one, it fits the proportions of the fly, but secondly, it's a good fly that works for both large species, larger members of the panfish family, larger sunfish, larger bluegills, but also works well for bass as well, bass and other predators like pickerel. So let's get started. I have the hook in the vise. You may notice that I'm using the shank jaws instead of the standard jaws, and I don't have the shank jaws mounted in the center hub. They're mounted in the offline hub, so I get a true rotation. But I really like the shank jaws because it gives me a little better access to the rear of the hook when I need it. So I've been a huge fan of those jaws once they came out. All right, so let's get started. For thread, I'm using a 6/0 Semperfli classic waxed thread in a fluoro green color. And the first step is I just want to create a thread base to give the super glue that I'm going to apply to the hook shank something to adhere to. We're going to be preparing the hook body and adding the a little glue to the shank of the hook, and then set that hook soaked glue, or that glue soaked hook, into the cork body. So we can just do that real quickly. And it doesn't have to be pretty here. I'm just doing a couple quick wraps to just give that glue something to soak into. And just do a quick half inch here, and then I'm going to cut away that thread. And for the purposes of keeping things moving here, what I typically do is you can push that cork body into the hook while it's in the vise, but before we do that, we have to prep that cork a little bit. So if you notice the fly, I'm going to put it back in the vise. If you notice, it's kind of hard to tell, but the fly has a flat bottom. And I keep that bottom flat so I don't impinge the hook gap. That's an important thing to consider. If you leave that popper body in a round profile, you may actually impinge the hook gap on a smaller hook like this size 6. So it's important to cut off an edge of that cork. So I basically take a craft knife, and I just slice off one edge of that cork ball, and that gives me that little flat spot. And with that flat spot, I'll take my craft knife or a razor blade, and I will make a slice right into the center of that cork ball. And that slot, or that cut that I made, is going to accept the glue-soaked hook shank. Now you can press that hook into the vise if you wanted to, but what I usually do is take the hook out of the vise, set that cork ball on a firm surface, and finding that slot, I will just insert the ball of the cork in and give it a pinch to seal it. And you could do it in the vise, but sometimes you may bend a hook. It takes a little bit of force to seat it in there, so I like to get that on a firm surface and just push the hook down into the cork ball. And that's what we're left off with. At this point now, this is time to come in here and color up that cork. The fly that was in the vise before was 3 colors. It was a kind of a yellow base coat with green and black over the top of that. And I do have a yellow body prepped out here, so I'm going to swap that out. And we'll mark it up from here with the yellow color. So the first step is, once I get the yellow base color on, I'm just going to come in here and throw a couple black marks, little dots. I get a lot of questions about how we get that real unique color on this fly, and this is the procedure. It's pretty straightforward. Just a couple irregular dots on there. And then I'm going to come in with a green color, and this is a very light green. This is a yellowish green. If you're a user of Copic markers, this is a YG06 yellowish green. And I'm just going to kind of fill in the spaces around. So let me get another one here. This one's a little dry. There we go. I'm going to come in and I'm just going to fill in the spaces, kind of leaving a little yellow halo around the black dots. And I tend to leave the bottom yellow as well. Sometimes I leave the bottom uncolored, so it's just kind of a white. Actually, I just went and colored it, didn't I? Not paying attention to what I'm doing. So in this case, it will not be left yellow. But I typically do leave it yellow. So let's just get in there and just mark this up. I'm just going to darken it up a little bit with the green. Again, leaving a slight yellow halo around the black dots. And when I apply that final coat of UV resin to this, these colors they'll all kind of marry and bleed together, and it looks really cool. The cork balls are made from cork particles that are pressed into a ball. So they kind of leave an underlying pattern as, once you're done with coloring it up. The next step here is to apply some UV resin. Or actually, before we do the resin, let's pop on some eyes. As I mentioned, the eyes are, they're kind of optional. I doubt the fish see them, but the fishermen sure do. And I have confidence in subsurface flies that have eyes, because I truly believe that the fish do key in on eye patterns on eyes on subsurface flies. Surface flies, they may or may not see it as it's moving through the water. But let's get eyes on this. I'm using 4mm dragon eyes from Flymen, but any 3 or 4mm eye will work just fine. And I'm going to put a little drop of gel super glue where I want to affix the eyes, and just press those eyes into place. This is always a messy job that never goes right. It doesn't look too bad. Screwed it up. Pardon my hands. And once I get them where I want them, I just hold them in place using the end of my bodkin for a couple seconds, just for the glue to set. And I set it very effectively right to my fingers. Awesome. Let's try that again. Another option for putting these eyes in is just to coat them with a little bit of UV resin and set those eyes into that pool of resin, and then hit it, and that'll hold them in place. Everything is going to be covered over with UV resin anyway, so that method works very well. In fact, I'll demonstrate that on the other side. So I'm just going to, this is Solares medium, and I'm just going to place a small dot of resin where I want that eye to go. And I'll pull off another eye. I'm trying to keep an eye on comments here. If anybody has any questions, just drop them in the comments. And we'll get that second eye in place. Let's make a quick adjustment. And as I mentioned, just coming in and hitting that with a UV torch is usually enough to get in there. A little bit of that resin squeezes out on the edges, and that will seat that eye in place. And from here, we're just going to coat the entire cork body with UV resin and hit it with a torch to set it. And that's going to give the popper a real high gloss, durable finish. And I like to work with small amounts of resin and just kind of move it around, put little dollops here and there and smooth it out. It will level very quickly, and that's one of the great things about tying with a rotary vise is that we can use that rotary function to help level things out like resin. And initially, you know, it looks a little sloppy, but it will all level out. This resin is actually probably a little thicker than it should be. This is an older bottle that's been around for a while. It feels like a little thicker than a medium should be. All right. Looks like we got a good coverage there. Just do a couple more checks, and then we're just going to spin this a couple times to even out that resin. Again, I'll spin it slowly a couple times just to allow that resin, if there's any low spots, to allow it to fill in. You see on this side below the eye, it looks like it needs a little. So sometimes if you just tilt it that way, you can get it to fill in. But we'll just add a little bit more in there. Okay. So with that slowly turning to keep things from dripping, I'm just going to hit it with that UV light and cure that resin. And give it a good cure, you know, 10, I mean, it hardens right up in a couple seconds, but I usually like to give it a good 30-second cure. And I will also, even though this UV resin, this UV torch from SolarRes does a great job, cures this up tack-free very quickly, I always put my UV cured flies in direct sunlight for a few minutes before I throw them in a box. All right. So we're done with the body. You can see here we got a great high gloss finish on that. We got some pretty cool modeling between the different colors, the black, the yellow. You even get a little red in there from certain types of super glue. Certain super glues will react with the alcohol-based markers and give a little red. It looks like on right up behind that eye there, you'll be able to see a little red tint, and that's from the super glue, but it certainly doesn't take away anything from the pattern. It looks pretty cool. So next step, we're going to start tying. We'll get the thread started on the vise. If anybody has any questions, just leave them in the comments there. I know this is a different format from the way Norvise normally does things. You can't see my face. I'm still working on a multiple camera setup here where I can get the be able to switch back and forth between cameras, and I'm hoping that you're seeing this without too much lag. I'm seeing a little bit of lag on my end. Not quite sure why that's there. So we'll start the thread behind the cork body, and I'm just going to throw down a quick base layer of thread. And again, we can always use the rotation feature of the vise to do that. It's real quick and easy to lay down a quick base layer. And one of the things I'm going to do here is I'm going to put in a mono loop, and that mono loop is going to serve two purposes. We're going to create a tie-in point if we want to add a dropper to this fly and to suspend a small nymph pattern or wet fly underneath it. But it also helps to stabilize the legs and keep them from fouling. So, because once that material, that Cohen's creature leg material, gets wet, it does get a lot softer than it is when you first tie it on the vise. This is what you want because it provides great movement, but you don't want it causing any problems at the hook. So what I'm going to use, I have some Mason hard mono here. This is in 20 pound, and I'm just going to cut off a 3/4 of an inch long piece, and I'm going to use that to tie in a loop. I do occasionally add weed guards to these flies, and this would be the stage if you were going to tie in a weed guard that you would add that weed guard as well. But to tie in the mono, I'm going to lash it down to each side of the hook. Here I'm starting on the back side. Sorry for bumping the camera. I get that lash down, and I'm going to form the loop, and I'm going to lash it down on the near side. And if I need to make an adjustment to that loop, you do it before you really add a lot of thread wraps. There's just 3 or 4 thread wraps on there now, and if I want to make that loop a little bit bigger, I can just insert something to increase the diameter of that loop. And I am going to lash it down on the near side of the hook. What that does as well is it creates a little flat spot, a real good tie-in point for those legs, so they're not going to rotate around when you tie them in. Come in and clip off that tag end. Again, just add a couple wraps of thread. Get a nice base on there. And I'm going to lift that up and I'll throw a couple wraps underneath just to set that in place. So this loop serves 2 purposes. It provides a place to tie in a dropper if I wanted to add a second fly to a popper dropper rig, and it also will help to create a stable base for the legs and keep them from fouling. So the legs are the next step. As I mentioned, I'm using Cohen's Creatures frog legs. For this particular fly, I'm using an extra small frog leg. It is 1 1/4 inches in length. That's what they look like. And again, it's a white material that takes dye very well. You can use fabric markers, which I prefer to use. You could use alcohol-based permanent markers like Copic markers, and their colors will fade a little bit after repeated dunkings, but it really doesn't make any difference to the fish. And I have one that I marked up before I started. So again, following the same color scheme, just yellow, black, and green. Put a couple yellow dots down first, fill in with green, and then just add some black to give you that effect. And I am simply going to, you can see there's a little flat tag there. That is the exact diameter of the top of my hook shank, because I put in those 2 layers of mono, or 1 layer of mono on each side. And that gives me a nice, flat, stable base to attach those legs. You can see that they're resting on that loop, and I have that loop accessible if I want to add a dropper to this pattern. So I am just going to come in and throw a few more thread wraps over that real quick, and then give it a quick coating of super glue. And that'll seal everything up. And lock both the frog legs and that mono loop in place. Now this, keep in mind that we're fishing panfish and small bass with this pattern. There could be some concerns if a larger fish grabbed that dropper, since the mono's not doubled over on itself, that it would pull out. I have never had that happen. I've caught bass up to maybe 4-5 pounds on the dropper. I've never had it come loose once it's tied in and secured this way, even though it's not doubled back on itself. But we'll throw a couple more brushes of super glue on that, and just coat it up with a couple more wraps of thread. All right. So we're actually on the home stretch. We're finishing, just about ready to finish this up. Gary, you were asking about the Cohen's legs. Yeah, I do have them on the site, but it's something that you can find just about anywhere. Most fly shops carry them. They're pretty popular, but we do have them on the Panfish on the Fly website. So the next material I'm using, again, this is another material from Semperfli. I mentioned earlier that we were using their classic waxed 6/0 thread for this. And the next material is the Semperfli Ice Straggle Chenille. This is a real great I love this stuff. I use it on so many of my warm water patterns. This is a slightly longer fibers coming off the core than the straggle legs or the straggle string, and these are I believe it's a 6 millimeter fiber that's coming off. So I still got a little bit of wet super glue there, which is going to help bind this down, and I am just going to add a few thread wraps to secure that material and throw a quick half hitch over this. Post my thread, and I'll use the rotation of the vise to wrap this around. And we'll come in and tie it off. What this material does, it adds a little bit of sparkle. It definitely adds a little bit of movement. And it does a good job basically covering up all those thread wraps. Next up, I'm going to add a piece of hackle. I have a pretty cool looking neck here. This really was a bargain basement neck. There's nothing special about it other than the color, and it's got some big, beautiful, wide feathers here at the back. And I'm going to select one of those from the neck, pop that off. And I'm going to use this feather to tie in some additional hackle around, basically a hackle collar that's going to provide a little bit more movement and just kind of add to the whole color scheme of the pattern. It matches that same green and black that we have going on here. So I'm going to prep the feather by just pulling those fibers back and exposing the tip. And I'm just going to come in and give that a snip. You don't have to get too crazy. This is all going to be covered over. And I'm going to advance my thread back about I don't know, maybe an eighth of an inch. And I'm just going to lash that down. And we can just leave that hang there for now. And the final material that I'm going to use are some silicone rubber legs. Sticking with that same theme here, a lot of different leg material you can use. This is it's just a basic Chartreuse and black barred. A little bit of flash, a little bit of sparkle in there, and I'm going to just cut the legs off in the length that they're bound in with. So I got two legs. They're about probably 3.5, 4 inches long, and I'm just going to have a total of 4 legs altogether, 2 on each side. And it's just a real simple, I'm just going to fold them in half around the thread. I'll do that on camera so you can see it. So they're just folded in half around the thread, and I'm going to lash 2 to one side, and then 2 to the other, and then we'll give them a quick trim. You could cut them to length, but because of the size legs that we're using on this particular fly, you end up with trimmed ends that you really can't do anything with. So I just add them on both sides, gather them all up, and then cut them to length. And that'll just make dealing with the hackle a little bit easier. Again, the length of the legs is 100% personal preference. Those are actually a little bit long. I'll trim them once I finish the fly. So to finish, I want to wind that hackle up towards the body. I'll bring my thread up in front of the legs and just park it there. And then we're going to wind the the hackle up. Now you can do it one of two ways. You can do the traditional way and just wind it around, but since we have an excellent rotary vise here, we'll use that rotary feature. Number one, it'll be a little easier to see what's going on because my big mitts won't be in the way, and so just clear the legs initially, and you may have to finagle around with them a little bit. We're just going to put one or two wraps behind the legs, and then we'll come up in between the legs and add a wrap there. This may actually be easier doing it by hand because I want to sweep those fibers back. So let me start that again. This feather's being a little unruly, so I'm just going to just kind of sweep those fibers back, get them going in the direction I want. And if the legs, they don't cooperate with you like they're doing here, whenever you do something live, you always run into some sort of problem. I could tie 100 of these at home with no problem, and then you sit at a table at a show or you get in front of a camera and everything goes sideways. But one of the great things about the Norvise is you got that indexing feature where you can come in and look at the fly from every angle. You can lock it top side, you can lock it 90 degrees, you can lock it upside down. All right, that actually looks pretty good there. So I'm just going to secure my hackle with a couple thread wraps and come in underneath and snip that off. I had a couple more thread wraps. One thing I like to do, just to ensure that we get a good clean seat on the knot, is I'm going to add a little bit of super glue to my thread here, and I'm going to do a couple turns of thread that's impregnant with the super glue right behind, and then come in with a whip finish. You can do it by hand, but again, I'll use a tool to keep my fingers out of the way. I have an extended reach whip finisher here, which gives you the extra room to come in and get around that body. So 5 or 6 turn whip finish, seat your knot, and we'll cut away our thread and call it done. Sorry for that awkward camera angle on the cut. So that's the finished fly. I'm going to trim those legs just a tad. They're just a wee bit long. You could probably leave it as is, but I'll give that about a 1/8 of an inch trim. That looks good. I like the legs just a little bit longer than the hackle itself. So we have a topwater fly called the melon head popper, or melon head frog, excuse me. It utilizes those Cohen's creature's frog legs, some Semperfli ice Straggle chenille for the body, which adds a nice little bit of flash, subtle flash, and some big, soft, wide Chartreuse Grizzly saddle hackle for a collar. And this fly provides a really interesting profile on the water. It's not something that fish see every day for sure. So it's a little bit unique in that regards. That's the melon head frog. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy fly to tie, and definitely one of my favorites. Does anybody have any questions on that? I'll take a look at the chat here for a few minutes. If anybody has any questions, just drop a comment. All right, so let me get started. Let's do another one real quick. We're going to stick with that frog theme. This is a much faster fly. It's a lot quicker tie, but it's another one that I use when I'm throwing frogs at, whether it's bass, pickerel, bowfin, even get into some larger frogs. They would make an excellent snakehead pattern. And this one tied larger is definitely fits that bill. The fly that I'm going to tie, it's going to be a little bit different. I have one that I tied up a little bit earlier using all hackle instead of the frog legs. But this pattern it's actually an old Jack Gardside fly. It is a spin-off of his immensely popular gurgler pattern. The gurgler, if you're familiar with it, has a wide leading lip here on the front to push a lot of water. And this fly was his bass bug. Let me adjust the camera here. I think I'm missing part of it in the frame. That should be better. This was his bass bug, which is basically a gurgler without that leading lip. And what's neat about this fly with that front end being a lot more streamlined, you can do a lot of things with this pattern. You can twitch it side to side. You can make it dive deep with a real aggressive strip on it. If you use a lot of natural materials that absorb water, you can actually suspend the fly or swim it just underneath the surface. I'm going to use a combination of both natural and synthetics. It's still going to keep that fly very light. It'll dry off quickly, cast like a dream, but it'll also it'll have that movement, that natural materials you can't get anywhere else. So this is Jack Gartside's bass bug, and we're going to tie this up as a frog pattern, sticking with the theme that we started with, using those Cohen creatures frog legs and some foam, the saddle hackle, and we can even use that ice Straggle chenille as part of the underbody to give us a little bit of flash. So let's get started on this one. And I know we sent out the materials list for the melon head frog. I will make sure that I get this materials list over to Casey as well, and she can get that out to anyone that's interested. We'll put it in all the information for the Facebook Live event. All right, so let's get started. For a hook, I'm using a Firehole 718 in a size 6. Now, one thing to mention about a lot of these new hook manufacturers, their sizing criteria is all over the charts. This is a size 6 hook, and this is a size 6 hook. And what you see in front of you are two very different animals. The sizing parameters on some of these hooks they just don't conform to standards. So the only advice I can give you is select the hook based on the fly you're tying and ignore the number designation on it. In this case, I'm looking for something a little bit larger with a nice big hook gap, and this Firehole 718 fits the bill perfectly. And we're going to tie this in the same fashion. We're going to add that loop at the back for putting a dropper in. We're also going to utilize some of those Cohen creatures frog legs, and we'll stick with the same thread. I have that Semperfli classic waxed 6/0, and we'll start with that. And I'm just going to lay down a quick thread base. And we'll go right down hook shank and give ourselves a... It doesn't have to be perfect. All this is going to be covered up, but just gives us something for the other materials to grip as we tie them in. The first step's going to be that hard mono. I'm going to get that hard mono loop in there. And also, if we were putting in a weed guard, this would be the time to add that weed guard. And you could do both. You could add a weed guard. You could put a mono loop in there if you want it. And I do tie these weedless quite often. But one of the issues with weedless flies, and if you tie a perfect weedless fly, you've probably tied a perfect fishless fly as well, because anything you do to interfere with the hook's ability to hit a weed or a piece of wood, it's going to have the same effect on a fish mouth. So since I tie my own flies, I'm not concerned about losing them. I don't worry about that. I'll just leave them weedless, and if I lose them to a snag now and then, I lose them to a snag now and then. So I'm just going to get a base of thread down on this. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to wrap this. This time I'm going to wrap a little bit further down the hook shank. And then I'm going to come underneath it and lift that up with a couple of wraps. Right underneath. Right underneath. Then come over the top again. And then I'll just lash down the rest of that mono right along the side of the hook. Probably get in there a little closer. For those that are still watching, what's the video? For some reason, I think it almost looks like I'm getting a little lag on my end. Are you seeing that as well, or is the video fairly clear? Still working out a lot of the kinks for this live stuff. I intend on doing a lot more live events on my own page, Panfish on the Fly, but I'm still working out a lot of the bugs, getting the camera set up and get everything working properly. And like I said, this time it looks like I'm getting a little bit of lag, so I may have some further work to do here. So we have our mono loop tied in. We're going to go this time. We're going to go with a size small frog leg. It was extra small on the melon head. And I colored it up basically the same way, using permanent markers, fabric markers in this case, to dye it up in a yellow, black, and green color scheme. And you can do these in any color that you want. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to lay down that frog leg material right on top of that wide base that I created by lashing down that hard mono. And that gives you a good solid base to secure these legs so they don't rotate around the hook shank. And got them in place. Nothing to it. Once again, come in with some super glue top and bottom and just give that a good soaking of glue. That'll help cement that mono as well as the frog legs in place. They're not going to pull out. So when I tie a gurgler pattern, I usually tie in the foam at this point. And for the foam, I use a couple different types of foam, but I really like this thicker stuff. This is 4.5 millimeter foam. And this particular foam is manufactured by Semperfli. Now, I don't know, I'm not quite sure if they're still carrying this or if it's going to be discontinued. I thought I saw on the website that the foam was being discontinued, but I think they were looking at other sources. But this is a 4.5 millimeter foam sheet in a Racophilia green, and this foam has some really unique properties. First of all, it's very strong, but it's also very light. It seems almost to have larger air bubbles in it. which means it compresses incredibly well, but still maintains a high degree of lightness, which is great for these type of patterns. What I've done here from a strip of foam, and that's just a basic strip of foam. What I've done is I've cut a strip just a little bit wider than my hook gap. I want a nice wide body on this fly, and I like to use the hook gap as a measurement, and on these wide gap hooks I end up with a nice wide body. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if I was tying a traditional gurgler, I usually lash down my foam at this point, create my body, and then bend the foam over to create the shell back and eventually the lip of the fly. The way Jack tied these, the foam was actually tied in, but it wasn't tied in and lashed down. It was just tied in and kind of left there. And you could tie this a couple different ways. We can tie it and leave the foam attached and just move it out of the way to put our body material in, which is what I'm going to do, and leave it hanging off the back. Or if you wanted to add some more foam to the pattern, you could lash it down to create an underbody and then fold it over. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring the foam to the rear of the fly, and I'll when you see the finished fly, you understand why I do this. I'm going to bring that foam right back to where the frog legs begin, and I'm just going to leave a little piece hanging over the back of the fly, and begin to tighten it down. Now, the first wrap, I use just light tension, a little bit more tension, a little bit more tension, a little bit more tension until we get it bound down finally. Once I get it down to where I have the final thread tension on it, I throw a couple more wraps of thread on. I also cupped it as I was wrapping, kind of squeezed it and help it form around the shank of the hook as it comes in. So you end up with that foam kind of creating a cocoon around the hook shank. All right, and then I'll just simply bring my foam up in front, and this is where I'm going to begin to tie in my body material. I'm going to use the same materials I used before. I'm going to use a saddle feather from that neck. This time I just, again, chose a feather with some nice long hackles. These are excellent feathers for bass bugs, even for streamer patterns. I tie a really wild perch pattern with this particular neck, and I'm going to miss it when it's gone. But for now, let's just, again, kind of tease out a few of those fibers, and we'll create our tying point. Just going to move that foam back out of the way and lash that feather down. Again, nothing fancy. Don't worry about things being messy. I have a material clip on this, so I will secure that into the material clip. And now I'm going to add my underbody material for a little bit of flash and color. Again, using the Ice Straggle Chenille from Semperfli for body material. And just real quickly, we're going to lash that down and bring that all the way back. I'll advance my thread to the eye. I'm going to throw a quick half hitch in there and secure it to the thread post. I can use that rotary feature to come in here, and I want to get real close, almost kind of go back on yourself to get as close as you can to the tie-in point of the foam. And then I'm just going to advance that forward, stopping about an eye length behind the eye. Then I'll tie that off. And I'm knocking everything off my desk here. That was a bottle of super glue. open bottle of super glue. We don't want to leave that. Sorry about that. All right, next up, again, throw another 1/2 inch in there. Drop the thread over the post, and I'm going to do the same thing with the saddle hackle, except with this saddle hackle, I want that to kind of in open wraps. I don't want a real dense body. I just want to have those fibers in place, and we're just going to wind that up in an open spiral so that underbody shows through. And I'll put a couple turns on top of each other right at the front to give that just move a little bit more water. And come in and tie that off. And we'll trim away the waist. I've come in with my fingers and just kind of fold that feather back and throw a couple of thread wraps, just forcing that back until I get about to the eye length, to one eye length behind the front of the hook. And from this point, we're just going to fold that foam over and lash it down and give it a trim. So before I do that, just kind of preen feather hackle fibers off to each side. And once again, just kind of cup the foam around the hook and give one wrap with light tension, moderate tension, and then start bearing down to full tension, right for the breaking strength of the thread. You don't want to cut the foam, but you want to give it a good seat. And I'll bend the foam back, throw a couple wraps in front, and at this point I can whip finish and call it done. Just get that foam out of the way, and a couple whip finishes right underneath, right at the eye, and cut that away. Now, to give this fly that streamlined appearance, I use a pair of long-bladed curved scissors. I have a really nice, I think these are the number 6s from Renomed with a curved blade. And see if I can get this on camera. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch the foam, and it's kind of tough to do with the camera here. I'm going to stretch the foam, come in underneath with the scissors, watching my thread. I don't want to cut my thread, and just give it a snip. And what that does, it creates that kind of bulbous shape in the front. And then I can do the same thing in the back. I can leave a little bit of a tab if I wanted added flexibility, but I'm going to keep this one cut a little thinner. And it was tough for me to do that with the camera in the way. I left a little bit more foam here than I wanted, so I could just come in and snip that away. And you could trim that up if you wanted to make it look a little prettier, but it really doesn't matter. And that's a really, really simple bass bug. You could add rubber legs. You could, if you wanted to add some more movement. I actively fish this fly by moving it through the water pretty quickly, and if you've ever seen a frog swimming, their front legs kind of pin back along the side of their body, and they're really not visible to the fish. So I don't add them. I do add them on the melon head frog because I fish that more like a popper. I'm fishing for panfish, and even bass sometimes. They like to, watch a floating bug for a while. I tend to fish this fly with a more active retrieve. And you can experiment with different colors. Of course, foam comes in every color under the sun. Different foam thicknesses. Again, I used a 4.5 mil, which gives this fly a good bit of flotation. If I went with a thinner foam, I could maybe get this to fish just underneath the surface, pushing a nice little wake as I bring it through. And again, you can add those rubber legs. If you wanted to add legs to the pattern, you can certainly add some rubber legs to add some more movement. But with this little bug, I just like to keep it simple, and It moves through the water real well. It is extremely lightweight and very, very easy to cast. And it also gives me the ability to add a dropper. If you wanted to, again, probably more for the fishermen than the fish. We could continue with that color scheme, and I could come in and add some more kind of frogginess to this fly here, and just add some irregular dots to it. If you wanted to throw some eyes on the front, you could certainly do that as well. Although on a fly like this, I'll just keep just as you see right here. Down dirty, really simple, easy to tie. You can see it's a quick tie. And you can experiment a lot with the materials. You can experiment, go entirely synthetic. You can go entirely natural, use a dubbed body, or maybe some sort of chenille or hurl if you wanted to give the fly a little bit more weight to it. When it gets wet, it'll sink a little bit more. As it's set up here, this will float like a cork and be very lightweight and easy to cast. And with that, I think we have been on for a little bit over an hour, and I think that was my time limit. So we'll call it done. Just a couple quick announcements. Next week, I think Cassie said that Brandon was tying. Let me double check that. But did not have a did not have. Yep. Did not have a pattern selected yet, so if you have anything that you would like to see Brandon tie next week, you can leave a comment below here, and the Nor-vise folks will take a look at it and get that on the agenda for next week. Again, my name is Bart Lombardo from Panfish on the Fly. If you're not familiar with Panfish on the Fly, we are a warm water website. There's a blog and a small online store. We kind of specialize in warm water fly tying and fly fishing. There's a big, heavy emphasis, of course, on panfish, but we also do quite a bit for larger warm water predators as well. And that is www.panfishonthefly. Real easy to find. You could also find us on Facebook. We have a business page, Panfish on the Fly, and there's also a Panfish on the Fly group, which is a pretty active group. We're over 17,000 members, so there's a lot of folks in there that share the same interests. So that'll be it for this evening. I want to thank Norvise again for giving me the opportunity to come on their live feed and do a little tying. And hope to see you around. Take care.